Look, I need you to understand something before I say any of this. I'm 73 years old. I have a bad hip, a pension I don't spend, and a house in Eastern Oregon that I have not left in 4 days because it's snowing, and every time it snows, I hear it. I feel it, really, in my back teeth, in the center of my chest, below where sound is supposed to live. I've had 2 audiologists tell me there's nothing wrong with my hearing. I had a neurologist, very polite man, fancy office in Portland, tell me the sensation is psychosomatic. That's the word he used. Psychosomatic. I didn't argue with him. I've learned not to argue. I've been not arguing for 44 years, and it served me about as well as you'd expect. What I have learned, the only thing I know for certain anymore, is this. There is something alive under the ice at Vostok Station, Antarctica. It was alive in November 1978 when I arrived at that station. It was alive in January 1979 when the Soviet drilling program opened the hole that should never have been opened. It is alive right now, today, as you listen to me say this. And the reason you don't know about it, the reason the governments of 2 nations that spent 40 years trying to destroy each other quietly, with unusual and unprecedented speed, agreed to never speak of what happened at that place, is because what we found 2 miles under the East Antarctic ice sheet made both sides understand that there are things in this world that make the Cold War look like 2 children fighting over a toy. I'm just a guy. I want to be clear about that from the start. Petty Officer First Class Thomas Rollins, United States Navy. My specialty was seismic monitoring equipment. I listened to ice. That was the job. You put geophones in the ice. You run cables back to your instruments. You watch the stylus move on the strip chart paper. You drink bad tea and wait. I was good at that. Not heroic. Not exceptional. Good at waiting, good at reading the machines, good at knowing when what the machines were telling me was wrong. That last part turned out to matter. In the autumn of 1978, the National Science Foundation attached me to the Soviet Antarctic program's deep ice drilling operation at Vostok Station as part of a scientific exchange arrangement. One of those brief, strange moments of détente that 1978 occasionally produced. 2 American technicians, myself and an atmospheric specialist named Garvey, who I'll mention again later, briefly, to observe, not interfere. We were observes. That was the agreement. We would observe. I want to tell you what I observed. I have a piece of paper on the table in front of me. Single sheet, crumpled, slightly yellowed at the edges, still faintly smelling of something I don't want to name. Soviet geological log paper. I know because of the Cyrillic header across the top. Vostok 3 Bruling log. Vostok 3 drilling log. I don't read Russian. I never have. But someone translated one line for me once. Handwritten in the margin in English. Black ballpoint pen. And I want to read it to you. Because these 15 words are what I've been living inside for 44 years. It is not water. It breathes. That's what the scientist wrote. That's what he found at the bottom of the borehole, 2 miles under the Antarctic ice, in December 1978. I'll tell you everything. How we got there, what the instruments told us, what Mironov saw under his microscope, what Bichter said from the bottom of that hole. I'll tell you what Borkov did, and what it cost him, and what it cost everyone. And I'll tell you why you should care right now, today, this year. Because the ice is thinner than it's ever been in recorded history. And the thing that lives under it has been reaching upward for a very long time, and the only lid we ever had on it is melting. The hum. I'll get to the hum. It started on day 3. In a way, it's never stopped. Vostok Station sits in the dead center of the East Antarctic ice sheet, about 800 miles from the nearest coast, at an elevation of nearly 11,500 feet. The average annual temperature is minus 55 degrees Celsius, minus 67 Fahrenheit. The coldest naturally occurring place on Earth. It is so cold that in deep winter, the air does things that air doesn't normally do. The Soviets had been operating there since 1957, weather monitoring, cosmic ray studies, glaciology, the kind of place where competent men go slowly strange from isolation and altitude and darkness. The deep ice drilling program had been running in phases since the early 1970s. By the time I arrived in November 1978, the primary bore was approaching 2 kilometers depth. The official purpose was paleoclimate research, ice cores, to read the atmospheric record going back hundreds of thousands of years. Legitimate science. The Soviets had excellent glaciologists. There was nothing dishonest about the Vostok program on the surface. The dishonesty was in what the program didn't know was down there. My assignment was to operate the American seismic monitoring array, 6 geophones spiked into the ice at measured intervals around the station, running cables back to a portable strip chart recorder I'd hauled down from Vostok Station. Standard NSF setup. The agency wanted a continuous seismic profile of the subglacial region, while the Soviets pushed deeper. Science. Just science. My log was supposed to be full of baseline readings and occasional microseismic events from glacial movement. Atmospheric background, ice fracturing under its own weight. Normal. The strip chart was quiet for 2 days. I need to tell you about the 3 men who matter in this story before I tell you what happened to them. Because I found, over 44 years, that the worst part of carrying a thing like this is knowing that the people who should be telling it are not capable of telling it anymore. Colonel Yevgeny Borkov commanded Vostok Station from his arrival in October 1978. He was maybe 55, built like a piece of heavy equipment, square, dense, designed for a specific purpose and not much else. He had done previous Antarctic tours and had the complexion to show it. Skin like tanned leather, squinting blue eyes that seemed to be permanently calibrated for distance and assessment. He did not welcome me, or Garvey, warmly. He shook my hand once, said in heavily accented but functionally correct English, "You will observe, you will not interfere." And that was, more or less, the entirety of our relationship for the next 6 weeks. Borkov trusted protocol the way some men trust God, completely, without examination, and with the absolute conviction that the protocol would hold even when circumstances were telling him it wouldn't. I need to tell you about Dr. Alexei Mironov before I tell you what happened to him. Mironov was the station's head glaciologist, 40 years old, maybe, round wireframe glasses that were always slightly fogged from the temperature differential between outdoors and indoors. He was one of those people who fills a room not with volume, but with attention. You felt him thinking. He had been at Vostok for 2 seasons before this one, and he knew the ice the way an old farmer knows soil, not just through instruments but personally. He had a habit, which I noticed in the first week, of placing one bare hand flat against the ice wall of the drill tunnel and holding it there, not for warmth, just to feel. I asked him about it on about the 8th day. He said in his careful English, "The ice remembers. I like to ask what it remembers." I thought he was being poetic. He wasn't. He was being Perez. I want to tell you about Victor Savin before I tell you what happened to him. The man who actually operated the thermal drill, monitored the return fluid circulation, read the core samples before anyone else got their hands on him. He was maybe 30, enormous, with a laugh that originated somewhere deep in his chest and arrived a full second before the rest of him. He called me Americanets, American, always with this grin, like it was the funniest word in any language. The first week, he showed me the drill head, still warm from that morning's run, and he pressed my palm flat against the housing the way Mironov pressed his hand against the wall, and said, in Russian that Kolkov later translated for me, "She feels everything you do to her." He meant the ice. I remember that. Victor Savin, 30 years old, enormous laugh, and the first one to understand what the ice was. I want you to remember that he said that. The 4th key person was our radio operator, Sergeant Kolkov, Andrei Kolkov, 23 years old, good English, funny in a dry way that took a week to tune to. He ran the station's communications. He would matter later. And there was Garvey, the other American, the atmospheric specialist. I'll be brief. He left Vostok on a medevac flight on November 28th, 2 weeks in, altitude sickness. His oxygen saturation wouldn't stabilize, and the Soviets flew him to McMurdo. At the time, I was disappointed. Later, much later, I understood that his bad lungs saved his life. On November 17th, 1978, the 3rd day of continuous monitoring, I became aware of a sensation that had no obvious source. I was at my station in the monitoring room, A converted equipment bay off the main corridor, 12 feet square, smelling of machine oil and cold metal, reading through the previous night's strip chart output. Nothing on the paper was unusual. Standard glacial, microseismics, background amplitude, what I expected to see. But I was aware, in a diffuse, body-wide way, of something I can only describe as pressure inside my chest. Not pain, not quite sound. Like standing close to a very large industrial transformer that's just slightly out of key. You feel it in your dental fillings. You feel it behind your sternum. I put a hand on my chest, checked my own pulse. Normal. The feeling didn't go away. I looked at the current strip chart output. The stylus was moving in a slow, perfectly regular oscillation. A long, gentle wave, one complete cycle, approximately every 32 seconds. The amplitude was within normal geological range. I would have logged it as standard microseismic activity from ice compression, except for one thing. The interval was perfectly consistent. Except for one thing. The interval was perfectly consistent. Exactly 32 seconds. Cycle after cycle after cycle. I let it run for an hour. Never varied by more than 1/10 of a second. Normal glacial movement is random, irregular. Real ice never produces a perfectly metronomic signal. I know that. I'd been in the ice for 3 posting cycles before Vostok, and I knew what random ice sounded like. This wasn't random. I ran my calibration checks, signal gain, geophone coupling, cable integrity. Everything nominal. The signal was real. I noted it. 914 hours. Low frequency oscillation. 0.031 Hz regular interval. Source, subglacial. Monitoring. I took the output tape to Mironov that afternoon because I knew he'd want to see anything subglacial. He looked at it for a long time. He ran one finger along the trace without speaking. Then he went to the ice wall behind his workbench and pressed his hand flat against it, the way I'd seen him do before. "When did this begin?" he asked. "This morning," I said. "This morning," I said. "Today." He said, "What depth did the drill reach this morning?" I didn't know offhand. I went and found Victor, who told me they'd broken through 1,800 meters, just past 1.1 miles. At around 830, about 45 minutes before I first felt the vibration in my chest. When I brought that information back to Mironov, he went quiet in a different way from his normal quiet. He went to his notebooks. He kept meticulous logs in Russian that I couldn't read, and he spent about 20 minutes cross-referencing something. Then he put the notebooks away and looked at me. "Has it been there before?" I asked. "This frequency?" "No," he said, and then, very carefully, "But I have been looking for it since last season." He wouldn't say more than that, not that day. But he kept my strip chart tape. He asked me to give him a copy of every reading going forward. I said yes. I said yes without hesitating, which meant that over the next 6 weeks I gave Alexei Mironov a detailed seismic record of everything the ice below us was doing. I want to be clear about that choice. At the time I thought I was doing science. I was. I was also documenting the first evidence of something that the United States government and the Soviet government would later agree, quite enthusiastically, had never happened. The drilling continued. By December 3rd, the bore was at 2,100 meters. By December 10th, 2,340 meters. The background hum, my word for it, the only one I had, became a constant presence. The way traffic noise becomes constant when you live near a highway. You stopped hearing it consciously, except that every 3 or 4 days it would shift in quality, and the shift would make you notice it again, like you were hearing it for the first time. The interval shortened. 32 seconds became 28, then 24. Not all at once, over weeks. Gradual, like something waking up slowly. Victor started getting headaches. He mentioned it to me over breakfast one morning, shrugging the altitude. He said, "Vostok sits at 3,488 meters above sea level. Hypoxia is a constant occupational hazard. Headaches are standard." He was cheerful about it. I was getting headaches too. I logged mine as altitude-related and didn't dwell. On December 8th, the first truly anomalous reading arrived on my instruments. I was running standard checks at 1,300 hours when I picked up a secondary signal nested inside the low background oscillation. Higher frequency, faint, right at the edge of sensitivity on my equipment. I almost dismissed it as instrument artifact. One of the geophone cables had a marginal connection that occasionally introduced noise, but the noise from a bad connection is random. This wasn't random. The signal was perfectly uniform, not just regular, identical, cycle to cycle, to a precision my equipment could not measure beyond. The same waveform, repeated, without variation. No geological process produces an identical signal. Geological signals have texture, variation, the analog roughness of physical processes. This signal had none of that. It was machine precise, and it was coming from directly below us. I ran the measurement 3 times with different gain settings, 3 identical results. I went to Myronov. He pulled out his notebooks from the previous season, 1977 seismic records, and found a page. He set it beside my current output. The same pattern. Weaker, more attenuated, but the same. Present a year ago. Before this drilling season had gotten anywhere near this depth. It had been there before we started drilling. Myronov, I said. He said, I submitted a report to Moscow about these readings in February. I was told the signal was equipment artifact. My equipment was calibrated at the Institute of Physics in Leningrad before this posting. It was not producing artifact. I asked if he thought Moscow believed that explanation. He took off his glasses and rubbed his nose. I think Moscow may have known what the signal was and preferred that I did not. He put his glasses back on, and I think it has become considerably stronger since the drill passed 1,800 meters. That was the moment I started paying a fundamentally different kind of attention. 3 watches at Vostok stopped simultaneously. Battery powered. A young engineer named Pavlov brought it up at breakfast. His watch had stopped at 4:17 a.m. Dead stop, new battery. Half a dozen men compared wrists. 3 more had stopped at the same time. Everyone laughed about it. I wrote it in my log. The temperature gauges in the bore began misbehaving on December 11th. Victor came to find me. His deep bore sensor, at 2,200 meters, read -3 degrees Celsius. It should have read -18. I spent an hour checking his instruments. They were correct. The reading was real. There is warmth down there, Victor said, very quietly, his voice entirely different from any register I'd heard from him. Flat, careful. At 2,200 meters there is warmth that should not exist. I nodded, because I knew the geology, because 2,200 meters beneath Vostok was the calculated upper boundary of Lake Vostok, the subglacial lake predicted to exist, never penetrated, sealed from the surface atmosphere for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. We were getting close to something that had been sealed shut for longer than the human species had existed. December 16th, 1978. I know the exact date because I wrote it in my log immediately after it happened, and the date is one of those facts I've never had to try to remember. It's just always there. Myronov was examining ice core samples from 2,180 meters in the geology lab. I'd been spending my off hours there because he thought out loud, and his thinking was more interesting than the Soviet television Vostok received via satellite, which was exactly as entertaining as you'd imagine. He was at his field microscope, his personal instrument, a high-quality German-made scope he'd hauled from Moscow at his own expense and treated like a colleague. Standard glaciological examination of crystal structure. He'd been doing the same thing at the same bench for 6 weeks. At 1440 hours, he stopped moving. He was bent over the eyepiece, and he simply stopped. Stopped the way a machine stops. No gradual slowdown. Just ceased. Rollins, he said. My name, no rank, no title. He'd done that maybe twice in 6 weeks. I walked over and looked at what he was pointing at. I'm going to try to describe what I saw in the eyepiece, and I'm going to do it imperfectly because I don't have his vocabulary. Ice at great depth shows a regular crystalline lattice under magnification, tightly packed hexagonal structures, small and ordered, the result of thousands of years of compression. It looks like tile work. That's normal. That's what glacial ice looks like. I'd seen it 100 times through scopes at 3 previous Antarctic postings. The material from 2,180 meters was not crystalline. The structure in the sample was curved, layered, with depth to it. The way wood grain has depth, but not rings, more like the cross-section of something organic. The walls between structures were thinner than anything that should survive glacial compression for 100,000 years, let alone 1,000,000. And between those walls, I saw movement. Very slow, very faint. Not water movement, not convection, direction movement. The kind of movement things make when they are going somewhere. Is that water? I asked. No, Mironov said, in a tone of voice that meant he'd been afraid it wasn't water for some time. Water doesn't do that. He increased the magnification. The walls between the chambers had surface texture, a repeating pattern, not geometric regularity, not the pattern of mineral crystal growth. The pattern of cells, deformed, compressed, old, beyond anything I had a mental scale for, but repeating. Organized. The signature of something that grew rather than something that formed. Mironov sat back. He took off his glasses and held them in both hands, and did not speak for a while. Alexei, I said, because I'd been calling him that in private for 2 weeks. He said, we are not drilling through glacial ice. He said it the way you'd state a mathematical result, neutrally, because the math doesn't respond to your feelings about it. We are drilling through something that was alive, or is alive, or is something that doesn't fit the category of alive or dead, in any way I was taught to apply those words. He put his glasses back on. This material has cellular structure. It has membrane. At this depth, this ice formed between 500,000 and 1,000,000 years ago. He looked at the wall. Antarctica is not a continent, he said. Antarctica is a lid. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The hum was in my chest right then, stronger than it had been all day, and I found I was holding my breath. A lid on what? I managed. He looked at me. On whatever has been living in the dark for 1,000,000 years, he said, and is now feeling someone drill toward it from above. Mironov went to Borkov the next morning. I was not in the room for the conversation. I was in the corridor outside it, which was close enough. The walls at Vostok are thick, but sound carries differently in extreme cold. It travels through solid materials rather than air, and the result is that you hear things as vibrations rather than distinct words, except when the voices are loud. Borkov's voice was loud. I could hear the shape of it. Mironov presenting, steady. Borkov responding, dismissive. Mironov again, higher register. Pressing. Borkov cutting back with specific authority. Then a long period of one-sided speaking that went on for several minutes, and was Borkov's voice exclusively. Then silence. Then the door. Mironov came out of Borkov's office and stood in the corridor with his hand on the doorframe. He saw me. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just been handed confirmation of something he'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. He says we continue, Mironov said. What did you tell him? Everything. The microscope findings, the cellular structure in the core, the temperature anomalies at 2,200 meters, the seismic pattern your instruments have been recording. He paused. The watch stoppages, the precision of the oscillation signal. Another pause. He told me the drilling schedule was set by Moscow, that we are expected to reach the lake boundary by January, and that my concerns have been noted in the official log. What does noted in the official log mean? Mironov smiled, once, briefly, without warmth. It means they are written down in a place where they will be found, eventually, and used to explain what happened, if anything happens. He went back to his lab. I went back to my instruments. The strip chart was running. The oscillation cycle was now at 21 seconds. Shorter by 3 seconds since that morning. Accelerating. I wrote the number in my log and stared at it. Something below us was aware of the drill. Something below us was getting excited. The radio interference started December 19th. Kolkov came to find me with a look on his face. I didn't have context for yet. He'd been running the routine contact with Mirny Station and had received something in the middle of an otherwise standard transmission. He had it on cassette. He played it for me, normal call signs, weather data, equipment status, and then, inserted cleanly between 2 normal segments, 4 seconds of sound, Victor's laugh, not Victor's voice, his laugh specifically, that chest-deep laugh I'd know anywhere. on an incoming transmission from a station 870 miles away, recorded with perfect fidelity. 4 seconds, then gone. Kolkov was pale. Victor was running a drilling shift in the next building. I took it to Myronov. He listened without touching the cassette, then looked at me. "This is new," he said. "What does it mean?" "It means it can hear us," he said, "and it is learning what it hears." 4 days later, my own radio kit received a transmission during my McMurdo check-in window. Not from McMurdo. 4 words, in English voice I had never heard. Not distorted, deliberate. "It can hear you." I logged it as atmospheric anomaly. I brought it to Mironov instead of McMurdo. "It's not just replaying," he said. The laugh was replay, intercepted and retransmitted. This second message was assembled. It heard enough of our speech to construct a sentence. He tapped the notebook. "How long has it been listening?" "The signal in the 1977 data, before we'd set a word into these radios." "Longer than we've been here," I said. Mironov nodded. He looked old suddenly, much older than 40. Victor found the first material anomaly on December 23rd, the same day I received the radio message. The return fluid from the bore, the kerosene drilling fluid that circulates from the cutting head back up to the surface, was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a person who knows their equipment recognizes immediately and a layperson would miss entirely. It was warm, not above freezing, still well below zero, but warm relative to what the bore temperature at that depth should have produced. And it contained particulate matter that wasn't ice crystal. Victor pulled a sample, brought it to Mironov. We were all in the geology lab. Mironov prepared the slide in about 3 minutes. I stood behind him at the microscope. The particles in the fluid were moving. Not fluid-carried movement. Not being suspended and carried by the flow of the kerosene. Independent movement. Purposeful. Directional. Slow. Branching irregular forms, not crystalline, not geometric. Biological. Something was coming up the bore. Mironov sat back. He said in a voice that had gone very flat and very steady, "Something is rising toward us." Then he said, "I need to show Borkov this." Now, he went to Borkov's office. I went with him. He set the sample slides on Borkov's desk and walked him through the microscope examination. He presented the temperature readings, the seismic data, the radio anomalies, all of it. He held nothing back. Borkov looked at every piece of evidence. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He examined the microscope images carefully. He asked technical questions about the temperature sensors, calibration dates, manufacturer, previous performance. He reviewed my seismic tapes. He spent 40 minutes with the full body of evidence. Then he said, "We are at 2,400 meters. The theoretical lake boundary is between 3,700 and 3,800 meters. We will continue drilling." Mironov said, "There is something in the ice, something biological, something that is responding to our drilling activity." Borkov said, "Doctor, our schedule, with respect, Colonel, loop respect, Colonel. The schedule is irrelevant to whether there is a living organism. The schedule was approved by the party scientific committee and is not subject to field revision without authorization from Moscow." Borkov stood. "Your samples are interesting. I will include a note in my next dispatch. Continue your core analysis." Mironov said one more thing. He said it quietly, looking at the floor. "Colonel, the bore goes down 2.5 kilometers, decides to come up that bore. We have no way to stop it." Borkov said, "Good night, Doctor." That was December 24th, 1978. Christmas Eve. I went to my bunk and lay on my back, hand on my sternum, feeling the hum move through me with its slow, patient regularity. And I thought about the word patient, about something sealed under 2 miles of ice for 1,000,000 years, feeling a drill come toward it from above and choosing to wait, choosing to learn, choosing to send messages upward instead of just moving. It had been waiting 1,000,000 years. What was another 6 weeks? The first transport aircraft arrived at Vostok on January 3rd, 1979. I want to say something about what I felt when I saw those planes coming in, ski-equipped Antonovs, military transport, not the science program resupply planes I'd seen before. I felt, I'm just going to say it, I felt dread. Real physical dread, because it meant someone at a level above Borkov had read what Borkov had sent to Moscow, and the decision they had made was not to stop the program. It was to expand it. 107 Soviet military personnel arrived at Vostok over 4 days in January. Not scientific staff, military, equipped with weapons, thermal assault gear, portable communications arrays, floodlighting for below-ground operations. They also brought 2 modified drilling rigs with bore heads 3 times the diameter of the existing drill, and a descent cage system, a modified mine cage on cable and pulley, designed to lower personnel into the bore. Borkov was sending men down. He toured his new assets with visible satisfaction. I watched him walk the line of soldiers, talking to officers, gesturing at maps of the bore site. He had the expression of a man who has finally been given enough force to match the problem. Mironov came to my monitoring station that night and sat across from me without saying anything for a while. The strip chart was running. The oscillation interval was down to 17 seconds. 17 from 32 when this started. More than half again as fast. I pointed at it. Mironov looked at it and looked away. "They're going to open it," he said. "Wide bore, fast descent, push straight to the lake. You've told him everything." "I've told everyone everything." His hands were on his knees, very still. I sent reports to Moscow, to the Academy of Sciences, to the Geological Survey Committee. Someone read them, and someone decided the correct response was not caution. It was troops. He looked at me. I think someone in Moscow decided this is a resource, or a weapon, or something that can be controlled and exploited if you bring enough force to the table. I said, "What do you think is down there?" If you had to say it simply, he thought about that for a long time. Then he said, "I think it is very old," he said. "Older than the ice above it, older than the continent. Something that existed before Antarctica was Antarctica, before the ice formed." He paused. "I think it has been patient. I think it has been waiting. And I think it has been learning from us since before we arrived. Since the first seismic charges we set off in the 1970s. Since the first radio transmissions into the ice. It has been listening, and learning, and practicing." "Practicing what?" I asked. He looked at the strip chart. "Communication," he said. "I think it's been practicing communication." The hum was very strong that night. Very present. Not painful. Just there. Completely there. The way a sound is there when you realize the room has been full of it for hours, and you only just noticed. The new drill team started January 5th. 12-hour shifts, wider borehead, better thermal elements, 40 to 50 meters per day. Mironov documented every core sample. I ran my instruments around the clock. The seismic readings changed character on January 11th. The primary oscillation, the 32-second cycle that had become 17, doubled in frequency again, overnight, from 1 cycle every 17 seconds to 1 cycle every 8. The amplitude held constant, but the rate doubled in approximately 4 hours. Between my 200 and 600 readings, I have the tapes. I looked at them, and looked at them again, and then went to find Mironov at 645. He was already up. He'd been up since 400. He had his own instrument records spread across the geology lab workbench, and he was looking at them when I came in. "You saw it," he said. "Yes." I set my tape down beside his papers. "It has been consistent," he said. "The rate doubles every time the drill passes a threshold depth. At 1,800, at 2,100, at 2,350, at 2,590, this morning. It correlates precisely with drill depth." He looked at me over his glasses. "Do you understand what this means?" "It knows where the drill is," I said. "It knows exactly where the drill is," he said, "and it knows that the drill is accelerating." He took a breath. "It is responding to us the way a nervous system responds to a stimulus approaching a sensitive area. The closer the drill gets, the faster the signal." Victor appeared in the doorway. He had something in his hand, a core sample from the most recent pull. He set it on Mironov's workbench without saying anything. He looked pale, and Victor was not a man who went pale. "Show him," Victor said to Mironov. Then, to me, "I found this, at 3,100 meters. Mironov took the core sample and set it under his microscope. He adjusted the focus. He motioned me over. I looked. The cellular structure in this sample was dramatically different from what we'd seen at 2,180 meters. The cells were larger, more defined, much more defined. They were clearly oriented, all pointing the same direction. Upward, towered the surface, towered us, becoming more organized as we approached the boundary. It's as if the organism, I'm going to use that word now, it's as if it's growing toward the bore, using the bore as a pathway. Victor said, "That is not all." He reached over and pressed his thumb into the core sample. Pressed hard. A strong man's force. His thumb went in. The way a thumb goes into clay. The surface sealed around the intrusion, and he pulled his thumb back and the surface sealed completely, smoothly, without leaving a mark. The bore wall did this, Victor said, at 3,100 meters. The resistance changed for maybe 20 seconds. The drill was there was no resistance, like drilling through water, like the ice wasn't there. Then it came back. He looked at his thumb. I thought my instruments were wrong. Then I took the sample. Mironov picked up the core sample carefully, turned it in his hands. He set it down. He said the bore wall at that depth became permeable. The ice became permeable. He picked up his pen. He wrote in his notebook for a while. I watched him write. The hum was in the lab with us, present in the floor and the walls, everything vibrating at its slow, even pulse. Everything vibrating at its slow, even pulse. Mironov capped his pen. He said, "We are not drilling through glacial ice. We have not been drilling through glacial ice. Since approximately 2,000 meters depth, we have been drilling through the outer tissue of an organism." He looked at us both. The ice above the lake is not ice, it is a scab. We have been cutting through a wound that never healed, and the body beneath it is beginning to react. Victor made a sound, not words. Antarctica is not a continent, Mironov said again. The same words as before, but heavier this time. Antarctica is a lid, and we are lifting it. I put my hand flat on the ice wall. I held it there. I felt the hum move through my palm into my wrist, up my arm, slow and regular and immense, like holding your hand against the side of something that breathes. Kolkov knocking on my door, and his face when I opened it. He said 2 words in Russian, caught himself, switched. It opens. The new wide-bore drill had punched through the lowest ice barrier into the airspace, or space of some kind, above the lake surface. The bore was breached. Borkov had been notified. Everyone was being called to the main drill building. I dressed in 30 seconds and ran. The main bore shaft occupied the central prefabricated structure, about 40 feet long and 20 wide. When I arrived, Borkov was at the bore head in full cold weather gear, standing like he was on parade. His 100 soldiers were there, filling the space, in equipment lines along the walls. The engineers, the drilling crew, Mironov at the edge of the crowd with his notebooks already open, already writing. Victor was at the instrumentation console. He gave me a look as I pushed through to him. "Temperature?" Borkov asked. "To the room." Victor said, "The sensor at the bore base reads positive 4 degrees Celsius. Silence, silence, absolute silence, except for the machinery and the hum, which was now strong enough that I could see it in the fine ice crystals that coated every surface. They were vibrating visibly. Plus 4 degrees, above freezing. 2 miles under Antarctica," Borkov said. "Increase bore diameter. Continue drilling." Mironov pushed through the crowd. Colon. Borkov looked at him. Colon. The bore is open. The pressure differential between the lake chamber and the surface atmosphere is unknown. If we widen the bore, we have no capacity to control, doctor. We have no containment. We have no containment. We have no protocol for what comes up the bore if we... Doctor. Step back. Colonel, there is a living organism at the bottom of that bore. If we... Step back. The room was quiet. Mironov looked at him. Borkov looked at Mironov, with the flat certainty of a man who has already decided. Mironov stepped back. He found my eyes across the room. His expression said, "It ends here, and we both know it. It took the drilling crew 4 hours to widen the bore to 90 centimeters. By 800 it was done, wide enough for a man to enter, vertically, in a descent cage. Planes arrived. Precisely the point. Borkov briefed his officers in rapid Russian while the engineers rigged the descent cage to the winch system. Kolkov translated for me in a whisper. The first descent team would be 6 personnel, 2 engineers familiar with the bore mechanics, 3 soldiers armed, and Victor Savin, because Victor knew the bore better than anyone else alive. Victor came to stand beside me while Borkov finished his briefing. He was suited up, descent gear, throat mic, headset. He looked at me. "You don't have to go," I said. He smiled, the first smile I'd seen from him in 2 weeks. "Americanettes," he said. "I put my hand on her every day for 3 years. I want to see what she feels like from the inside." I didn't know what to say to that. I put my hand on his shoulder for a second, and then he went with his team to the borehead, and they strapped into the descent cage, and the winch began to move. I was in the monitoring room with Mironov, listening to the radio relay from Victor's throat mic as the cage descended. The relay was clear. Victor called out depth markers every 100 meters in a steady, professional voice. Mironov sat beside me, writing. I had my strip chart running and my own radio kit recording the transmission. They passed 1,000 meters, 1,000, 500, 2,000. Victor's reports were technical and orderly. Bore wall condition, temperature readings, fluid levels in the bore lining, everything normal, everything as expected. At 2,800 meters, Victor said, "I see light." Miranov's pen stopped. "Yes, from below, not our lights. From below, a pause. It is blue, very faint, like looking down into harbor water from a dock at night, from very high up." I looked at Mironov. He started writing again. "Continue descent." Borkov's voice from the drill room, monitoring the same feed. "Continuing," Victor said. "Professional. Calm. At 3,100 meters, the walls are different. The ice, I can see through it. Like very old glass. Very thick. And there are shapes behind it. Moving slowly. A pause. They are large. I cannot tell how large. Describe the shapes," Borkov's voice. "I can't. They're not. It's like watching something through a frosted window from outside. You see movement and depth, but not detail." Another pause. "It's warm. I can feel it through the suit at 3,300 meters. There is a sound. Not our equipment. Something, it's in my chest. Like a..." He stopped. "Victor, describe the sound," Borkov said. A long pause. 5 seconds. 10. "Like a heartbeat," Victor said. "Not mine." I pressed my palm against my sternum. His hum was my hum. Same frequency. Same slow, enormous pulse. At 3,412 meters, Victor said, "There is something across the bore. A surface. Thin, translucent, like a membrane. I can see the blue light through it. It seals the bore completely." A pause. "I'm going to touch it." Mironov grabbed the transmitter from the operator. "Victor. Negative. Do not touch it. It is very soft," Victor said, as if he hadn't heard. "The texture is like the inside of static." Then, very quietly, one word. "Oh," in a voice I had never heard from Victor Savin. Not fear, not pain. Something I didn't have a word for, and the complete absence of any feeling I recognized. "Static. 70 seconds of static." Mironov said Victor's name repeatedly into the transmitter. I watched my strip chart. The stylus was moving in arcs. Enormous arcs, the largest amplitude I'd seen in 6 weeks. The oscillation now at about 4 seconds per cycle. "Fast. Very fast." Victor's voice came back. His voice, but wrong. The register was correct. The accent was correct. But the rhythm of his words was different too, even too measured, like someone reading aloud in a language they've recently learned. "I am inside," Victor's voice said. "There is no bore anymore. There is space. Very large space. I am looking up and I can see the bore above me like a hole. Very small. Very far. Up. A pause. It is warm. It is very warm down here." Mironov said, "Victor, can you actuate the cage winch? Can you ascend?" Victor's voice. "I don't want to ascend. The room went silent. Victor's voice, "You should come down. All of you. It is warm and it is, I don't have the right word. It is large. There is no I can feel in every direction, and there is no end." A pause that stretched out, out, out. "It has known about you since before you arrived. It felt the first seismic charges you set off in the 1970s. It has been listening to your radios since the first day you turned them on. It knows your voices. It knows your names." Another pause. "It has been remembering everything. It has been waiting for someone warm enough to hear properly." "Victor," I said, though I wasn't at the transmitter. I said it to myself, to the room. "Victor, I'm staying," Victor's voice said, calmly, with something that sounded, horribly, like contentment. "I wanted you to know that's my choice. It's warm down here, and I understand now. I understand why. I always put my hand on the ice." Then the transmission ended. The winch brought up the cage. Empty. Borkov ordered 4 soldiers down the bore on roped safety lines. At 930. His military protocol working the only way military protocol knows how to work. You send more people. At 10:11 hours, the floor of the main drill building moved. Not a seismic event. Not a vibration. The floor moved. Slowly. Like the surface of water when something large passes underneath it. A rolling displacement. Smooth. Originating from directly below. A young corporal named Denisov, standing near the bore head, went into the floor. He didn't fall. He went in. He was standing with his weight on both feet, and then one foot was ankle deep in the floor, and then he was knee deep, and then hip deep, and then he was looking straight at us, his arms above him. His face was not afraid. His face was the same expression Victor's voice had carried. Something between wonder and the absence of feeling, I knew. Then he was gone. The floor surface was smooth and unbroken above where he had been. I want to be accurate. This happened in about 8 seconds. Nobody in the room moved for a moment. Then everyone moved. Borkov's voice, barking orders, soldiers going to positions. I backed against the far wall, and the room was chaos, and the hum. The hum was now something else entirely, not in my chest, not in my teeth. It was in the walls, in every surface, in the air. As if the air itself had a frequency, the walls began to show things. The same phenomenon Victor had described from the descent, shapes behind glass. But now we were surrounded by it. Every ice wall in the building had become translucent, and through the translucence you could see what lived behind it. Vast structures, layered, branching, enormous, moving with the unhurried slowness of something whose scale means that slow from outside covers tremendous distance. The blue light from somewhere far below, lighting everything in a light that had no warmth in it, but somehow wasn't cold. Walls breathing, pulsing. In 12 minutes, the temperature inside dropped from -22 to -58. I know the exact number because I was watching the gauge when it happened. I watched it drop, and I started moving. Because at -58 degrees Celsius, you have very little time before the moisture in your lungs starts to freeze. And I was not going to die, standing still looking at a thermometer. Garvey, I thought. Garvey had bad oxygen saturation at altitude. They medevacsed him out 3 weeks ago. His lungs saved him. I grabbed Miranov's arm and ran. In the corridor, someone's radio, Kokov's radio, I think, at the communication station transmitted something. A voice. Not any voice from our team. Every voice from our team. Combined, mixed, averaged into something that used all of them and was none of them. Deliberate and clear and unhurried. You are the first ones from the surface who have been warm enough to hear that sentence. I've heard it every night for 44 years. Borkov organized his soldiers. Borkov organized his soldiers. God help him, he organized them. 200 years of military doctrine kicking in without asking whether military doctrine had anything to offer the situation. He had his men in defensive positions around the complex within 20 minutes. He had his engineers rigging shaped demolition charges. Around the bore head assembly, he was going to collapse the bore, cut off the access, seal it from above. Military thinking, and not wrong thinking. Not entirely. They detonated the charges at 11:15 hours. The bore collapsed. 3 kilometers of bored ice sheared and compressed, and the drill assembly cratered downward into the fill. The building shuddered. Ice dust and crystal filled the air. The shapes in the walls went still. The temperature held, stopped dropping, and the hum for about 10 minutes. The hum went quiet. Silence. Real silence. The first real silence I'd felt in 6 weeks. I stood in that corridor with my back against the wall, and I breathed. Just breathed. It was so quiet I could hear my own pulse. Then the compound outside began to rise. Not crack, not break, rise. The entire outdoor compound, an area roughly 40 by 60 meters, snow and packed ice, lifting in a single, smooth, continuous dome from below, taking about 4 minutes to reach 12 feet at the center. The surface of the dome was translucent, and through the translucent surface the blue light was visible, and through the blue light the shapes, much larger now, much closer than they had any right to be. If the bore had been successfully collapsed, the bore hadn't sealed what was already above the bore level. We'd blocked the highway. We hadn't blocked what had already moved. Borkov's soldiers opened fire. Of course they did. Carbines, heavier weapons, everything they had. The rounds that connected with the dome's surface behaved in 2 ways. Some deflected, redirected, along the surface, in a smooth arc, like water off a bowl, never penetrating. Some went in, and made no sound inside. No impact, no secondary effect. Just gone, absorbed, the surface sealing behind them instantly. Firing into that dome was exactly like firing into the ocean. The ocean is not harmed, but there was a response. The surface opened, not from bullet impacts, a seam running about 8 meters, from inside smooth and deliberate. From the seam extended pale tissue. Long sections, jointed irregularly, moving with the tentative, exploratory quality of something trying a new function for the first time. Tasting the air. Not aggressive, not fast, just reaching. 3 soldiers were taken. The first one running and caught. 1 pale section moved quickly. 1 moment of speed in all that slowness, wrapped his torso and drew him not into the dome, but into the ice surface, beside the dome, which became permeable for him and sealed. The second one fired his carbine at the section holding the first man, and then ran 20 meters before the ground beneath his feet changed. He was running 1 moment. Then he was gone, and his footprints in the snow ended mid-stride. The third one was taken from below. That's all I'll say about the third one. Borkov, across the compound, was watching all of this with his sidearm in his hand. With his sidearm in his hand. I want to describe it to you correctly, because it matters to the story. This specific moment before the end of it, he was not panicking. Borkov was constitutionally incapable of panicking. What I saw in his face was something closer to professional concentration, the expression of a man processing a tactical situation that has exceeded his doctrine, looking for the variable that changes the outcome. He was still trying to find the variable. He was still, even then, believing there was a variable. The vehicles were in the bay, on the north face of the complex. Tracked personnel carriers, snowmobiles. The right instinct, north, fast, away from the dome. The vehicles were the only option. I was already running. Mironov was behind me, and I will tell you something about Mironov running for his life. He was still writing. He had his notebook out, running flat out in extreme cold weather gear, writing in his notebook. I grabbed his arm and he kept writing with the other hand. Alexei, close the notebook. If I don't record it, close the notebook and run. He closed the notebook. We made it to the vehicle bay with 11 other survivors. During those minutes, the other losses happened. The accounts I compared with Mironov afterward put the total at 62 soldiers lost in and around the compound, in the drill building, in the corridors, in the supply annexes. 62 in about 40 minutes. Some fell through floors. Some were taken through walls. Some, and this is the part that stays with me most, the part I think about when the hum is present and the snow is falling outside. Some walked toward the dome, not running, not fleeing, walking toward it calmly, stripping off their gloves, faces clear and open, like men walking home. We were loading vehicles when Borkov appeared at the bay doors. He stood there for a moment with his back to us. His hand was on the latch. Then he turned. His face. I said I'd describe his face. He had the expression of a man who has just solved a calculation he didn't want to solve. Not afraid. Past afraid. Something resolved in him. Some argument that had been running for 40 years between who he was and what he was seeing. And the argument was over. He said in English, it was always going to be this. The bay door bent inward behind him. One smooth, continuous motion. No braking. No impact force. Just the shape of the door changing. And in the space behind the door was pale, translucent tissue. Moving. Borkov turned back to face it with his sidearm out. I heard 3 shots. I heard him say something in Russian. Short. Final. Then the bay filled with blue light. Then Borkov was not in the bay. I started the carrier engine. Mironov was beside me. We drove north with everything we had. 6 hours out. 150 miles from Vostok. Driving hard north into the darkness, the vehicle radio, not our transmitter, the receiver, spoke. Victor's voice, Russian first and then English, as if it knew I was in the vehicle and needed translation. I have Mironov's transcription. I've read it maybe 1,000 times. This is Victor. I know you're driving. I know you're driving north. I want to tell you what it's like down here before you get far enough that you can't hear me anymore. It's very large, larger than I thought. There is no center, not exactly. There is a deepest place. A place where it is most itself. Place, it extends outward through the ice, through the rock, beneath the ice, through material I don't have words for. I can feel it extending. It's like being a nerve ending in something whose body is a continent. It is very old. I can feel how old it is, the way you feel the age of a very old building. It's in the quality of the silence, the weight of time settled into the structure. Older than the ice, older than this continent in its current form. It was here when Antarctica was somewhere else and something else. It is not aggressive. I want you to understand that. What happened at the station, it was not malice. You were warm. You were the first warm things it had sensed approaching in a very long time. And it moved toward you, the way a person moves toward a fire in the cold. Not to harm the fire, to be near it, to be warmed. It knows you're afraid. It can feel that you're afraid. It doesn't understand fear entirely, I think. Not yet, but it is learning. It samples everything, incorporates everything, adds to what it knows. It has been doing this since before there were warm things walking on its surface. And I'm translating this very roughly. I don't have the language for exactly what it says. It says, come back when you are ready. It will be here. It will wait. It is good at waiting. I'm staying. I wanted you to know that's my choice. Not because I was taken. Because it's warm down here. Because I understand, now, why I always put my hand on the ice. And because I think I was always listening for it. Victor Savin. Out. I drove. I didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. Mironov had his notebook open, writing, transcribing with one hand in the dark. When the transmission ended, he closed the notebook and held it on his lap and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he sounded like himself. Yes, I said. That's the worst part, he said. It was, it still is. Victor Savin. Laughing from somewhere 2 miles under the ice, sounding exactly like Victor Savin. We drove for 41 hours. Me and Myrov and 14 Soviet survivors, military men mostly, young. Quiet in the way people go quiet when the categories their world was organized into have stopped applying. At the 200-mile mark, Mironov pointed out the rear window. Shapes at the horizon. Large, dark shapes, structures, or things that moved like structures should not move. At the edge of visibility, maintaining exact interval with our vehicles. Not closing, not falling back, matching our speed precisely. Escorting us, maybe. Watching. I don't know. They were present for the next 100 miles. I checked the rear mirror every few minutes. Every time. The same distance. The southern sky was lit wrong. I know the aurora. I know what the aurora looks like. What was in the southern sky for the first 300 miles of that drive was not aurora, a steady blue, without movement, the exact color of the light we'd seen inside the dome, not following us north, staying south, but visible, constant, like a marker, or a signal, or a reminder that something knew exactly where we were. The storm hit us at the 250-mile mark, winds at 80 knots, visibility down to a few meters. We lost one snowmobile to engine failure. No one was lost. The crew crammed into the carrier. We drove through 8 hours of storm by instrument and compass and something close to prayer, and came out the other side with the vehicles intact. I felt the hum die, not fade, not diminish gradually, die. Like throwing a switch, the vibration in my chest, the pressure in my teeth, the low pervasive presence that had been the background tone of my existence for 6 weeks, gone, instantaneously, completely. The air changed quality at the same moment. The cold was still the same cold, -40, hostile. But it was ordinary cold. The cold of physics and geography, not the cold of something enormous and alive, pressing against the walls of the world. Ordinary silence. The silence of wind and ice and nothing else. I started crying. I drove and I cried, and I couldn't tell you why. I just couldn't stop. I think it was the relief. The physical bodily relief of a pressure lifting that I hadn't fully understood was there until it was gone. Like standing in a walk-in freezer for 6 weeks and finally stepping out and the door closing behind you. The hum just closed. The shapes at the horizon were gone past that point. The blue light in the southern sky was gone. Mironov looked at the point where we'd crossed the threshold. He'd been marking distance, and he noted it in his notebook. It has limits. Everything has limits, I said, because I needed to believe that. He said, yes, for now. We reached Mirny Station 16 hours later. 16 of us, in 2 vehicles, out of 107, who had arrived on those military transport planes. The Soviet personnel at Mirny had been trying to raise Vostok for 2 days. The look on their faces when they saw what we brought back told me everything. I was separated from the Soviet survivors within 12 hours. Within 12 hours. A U.S. Navy transport met me at Mirny 48 hours later and flew me to McMurdo, then to Christchurch, then to a facility in Northern Virginia I was never given the name of. Fluorescent lights. Windowless room. Small table. 2 chairs. The man who came in wore a gray wool overcoat over a dark suit. No insignia. No rank. No name offered. No name requested. American, I was fairly certain, though not entirely certain. He set a briefcase on the table and opened it, and never took anything from it. Looked at me for about 5 seconds, and said, the incident at Vostok Station was the result of a cascading mechanical failure in the Soviet deep drilling apparatus, leading to a partial structural collapse of the facility and associated installations. 17 Soviet personnel were killed in the collapse. 1 American liaison technician was evacuated from the region following minor cold weather exposure. The Soviet government has extended its condolences. A joint scientific review committee will convene in Geneva in March to assess the status of the Vostok deep drilling program. He said all of that without a single pause or inflection. Not reading from notes. Reciting from memory, the way you'd recite something you'd rehearsed many times. I said, that's not what happened. He looked at me. That is what happened. I said, there are 15 Soviet survivors who can corroborate. The Soviet survivors are being debriefed separately. Their accounts are consistent with the mechanical failure explanation. There are documented seismic records, microscope samples, radio logs. Your seismic monitoring records were lost in transit between McMurdo and Christchurch. A formal notification has been filed with the NSF. The samples and secondary records from the Soviet program were damaged in the facility collapse. He paused precisely. This is documented. He took a form from the briefcase, set it on the table, slid it toward me. Signature line at the bottom. I was 26 years old. I hadn't slept properly in 5 days. I was sitting in a warm room with electric light, and there was grass somewhere, outside, and I wanted to see it more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. I wanted to see an ordinary room in an ordinary house in a place where the ground was just ground, and the ice was just ice, and the silence was just silence. I signed the form. I'm not ashamed of that. Not anymore. I was young and tired, and they were going to take me home, and I would have signed anything they put in front of me to get on that plane. I signed. I went home, I tried to become the person I'd been before. I came home to Oregon in February 1979. Medical discharge. Classified service-related condition. The pension arrived. 6 weeks later. I have not worked since, and no one has ever asked me why, which tells you something about what my medical records say. Alexei Mironov. I tried to find him 3 times over the following decade. Not in the Soviet academic database after 1979. No publications, no institutional affiliation. A colleague in Leningrad sent me a letter in 1984. Mironov had been admitted to a psychiatric facility outside Moscow in early 1979. Parts of the letter were blacked out. I went to find him in 1991 when the Soviet Union started coming apart. 2 weeks and 3 translators. He was in a room with a window looking onto a frozen courtyard. Thinner, older, but he had his wireframe glasses, and he recognized me. We sat across from each other and he looked at me for a long time, hands very still on the table between us. Then he said, "The hum. Do you still feel it?" I said yes. Sometimes, faintly, in the cold. He nodded slowly, confirming a calculation he'd hoped would come out differently. Then he said, "It's getting louder." Those were the only words he said. He turned to look at the courtyard. I sat for a few minutes, and then Lafitte, his facility, closed in 1994. I have not been able to locate him since. Kolkov, Andrei Kolkov, the radio operator, drove a taxi in Vladivostok for years after discharge. Died in 2003. His obituary said poor health for many years. I read between those lines. Garvey, the other American, the man with the bad lungs, who left 3 weeks in. I looked him up in 2005. Healthy. Retired in Arizona. I thought about calling him. I didn't. What would I have said? His bad oxygen saturation saved his life from something he doesn't know happened. Victor Savin did not come home. Victor is still down there. I believe that. Warm and remembering and putting his hand on something he finally understands. I have one piece of evidence. One thing that I kept and that has never been found and taken from me in 44 years. The drilling log page, December 16, 1978. Mironov's handwriting on Soviet geological log paper, Cyrillic text I cannot read. The microscope sketch in the margin, the temperature readings. At the bottom of the page, in English, in black ballpoint, Alexei Mironov's handwriting. It is not water. It breathes. It's in an acid-free sleeve on the table in front of me. I've kept it in acid-free sleeves since 1985, when I learned how paper degrades. It is 44 years old and the paper is slightly yellowed at the edges, and it still smells wrong, not rot. Something I have smelled nowhere else in 44 years on Earth. This is my proof. Proof that a brilliant man put his hand on living ice and wrote down what he found. Proof that I was there. Proof that I am not insane. Proof that I am not insane, which has been the question I've been answering to my own satisfaction for 4 decades alone, in an ordinary house in Oregon where the ice on the winter windows is just ice, and the silence is just silence, and the hum, when it comes, is quiet enough that I can almost convince myself it's in my head. Almost. I need you to look something up. The Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. The Madrid Protocol. Signed October 4th, 1991. 1991. It imposes a moratorium, indefinite reviewable, after 50 years, on all mineral resource extraction activities in Antarctica. No drilling, no mining, no resource exploitation of any kind. Signed by all parties to the original Antarctic Treaty, including the United States and what remained of the Soviet Union. The official justification: environmental protection, preservation of Antarctic ecosystems. Very reasonable, very sensible. In 1991. Consider this, 1991. The Soviet Union was disintegrating. 2 nations that had spent 40 years in ideological and military opposition over every piece of territory on Earth agreed, with unusual speed and without the usual diplomatic friction, that an entire continent should be permanently off limits to human extraction. No negotiations, no protracted territorial dispute, just agreement. These are nations that couldn't agree on satellite communication handshakes. Ask yourself who else signed it. 12 nations originally, 26 parties now. including nations that don't agree on anything and never have. All of them agreeing, quickly, cleanly, on this one issue, in this one place. The Madrid Protocol is the cover-up, dressed in environmental language, and signed with diplomatic smiles by men who knew what was under the ice, and had decided correctly that nobody should ever go back. I believe that. I believe the protocol was the right decision. If I could have signed a document in January 1979 saying nobody would ever drill in Antarctica again, I'd have signed it the moment we crossed that threshold and the hum went quiet. But a law is only as good as the people who follow it, and the protocol is reviewable. Its moratorium ends in 2048, and there are already nations, I won't name them, you know which ones, circling the treaty language, looking for reinterpretation, testing the diplomatic water, looking for reinterpretation, testing the diplomatic water. They want to know what's down there. They don't understand that what's down there already knows about them. The Antarctic ice sheet is losing mass. You've read this. It's in every climate report, every scientific survey, every news cycle that bothers to cover the data. The numbers have been alarming for years. But here's the specific thing I need you to hear. The East Antarctic ice sheet, the one that was supposed to be stable, would hold. It is showing anomalous melt patterns around the Vostok region, not at the coasts, where you'd expect warming effects, in the interior, at depth, from below. From below. In 2012, the Russians drilled again. They said they had improved protocols. They said they had learned from the experience of the 1970s program. They said the original discontinuations had been equipment-related. They reached the lake. The water samples that came up the bore contained DNA sequences from organisms that matched nothing in any existing biological database. This was published. You can find the papers. Organisms from an isolated subglacial environment, cut off from the surface atmosphere for 15 to 25 million years. That's what they reported. That's the scientific paper. Organisms, plural, unknown. I know what the organisms are. I felt one of them in my chest for 6 weeks. The Russian Antarctic program reduced personnel at Vostok Station by 60% in 2015. No official explanation. No official explanation. In 2016, a report circulated in glaciology circles about anomalous seismic activity in the Vostok subglacial region, not from tectonic sources, regular rhythmic, periodic seismic pulses. The report was submitted for peer review and then not published. The Russian program has not released new Vostok data since. I think about what Mironov said, at the boundary, 41 hours of driving from the place where the floor moved. It has limits. For now. For now was 1979. The ice is thinning. Every year, the lid is getting thinner. And the hum, I need to tell you this last thing. The hum that cut off at the 340-mile mark on January 15th, 1979, the hum that went quiet like a switch thrown, it came back. Not immediately, not for years, but it came back. I first noticed it again about 3 years ago. Faint, much fainter than it was at Vostok. Faint the way it was in those first 3 days, when the drill had just passed 1,800 meters, and something below stirred and turned toward the surface. Faint, and getting stronger. I don't think it's psychosomatic. I don't think it was ever psychosomatic. I think the ice is thin enough now, in enough places, that it doesn't need anyone to drill toward it. I think it's been reaching on its own. I think it has been patient for 1,000,000 years, and it is still patient, and patient doesn't mean passive. Patient means it will wait as long as it takes. The hum. It's there right now, as I sit here with this piece of paper on the table and the snow coming down outside, and the world as ordinary as it's ever been. Below the sound of the snow, below the sound of the heater, below the baseline of everything. Patient, reaching, waiting, always there.